So to start us off in a good way, I wanted to acknowledge the land that I'm on. I'm located in Tekaronto, also known as Toronto, which is in Mohawk means where the trees are standing in the water. Today, Tekaronto is covered under Treaty 13 and the Williams Treaties. It's the traditional territory of many First Peoples, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. This territory is also part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, a treaty made between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, Haudenosaunee, where nations enter into an agreement to protect the land and responsibly care for its resources in harmony together. As a settler, I've been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect, and I recognize my responsibilities as a treaty person to engage in the meaningful and continuous process of truth and reconciliation with all of our relations. I'm grateful to be on this land. So if I could ask Leif to put up our initial presentation slides. So to get started, I'm going to give a little summary of Green Communities Canada and some of the work that we do, and then I'll introduce our speakers. So we know that sustainable and climate-ready communities are needed, and we know that this need is urgent. For nearly 30 years, Green Communities Canada has connected and supported community organizations across the country to accelerate climate action. We're deeply focused not just on the why we should take climate action, but on the how. How do we make the momentous shifts we need that are needed in such a short period of time? How do we address the very real barriers that communities, and particularly marginalized communities, face to taking action? How do we ensure that our work is intersectional and inclusive? And how do we make these shifts last? Our programs are diverse and always transforming, but our goal remains the same: invest in building local capacity needed to accelerate ambitious climate solutions. Today, we support more than 50 organizations, and together we drive equitable and transformative change from coast to coast to coast. We do this by providing a network for organizations to share resources and knowledge, offering programming and services that organizations can roll out on the ground, and funding the organizations that lead this vital work. Our work at GCC focuses on 3 areas of climate impact: sustainable mobility, residential energy efficiency, and EnerGuide and green infrastructure. GCC's leadership in community-based energy efficiency programming is unparalleled. We've been designing and delivering retrofit programs for over 25 years, including piloting the Government of Canada's EnerGuide auditing service and designing the Province of Ontario's electric and gas low-income retrofit programs. Our member organizations and their energy advisors work with homeowners and contractors every day to implement a broad range of retrofit initiatives we are intimately connected to the experience of those working on the front lines of climate action. In 2022, GCC received funding from 3 philanthropic foundations to launch our Deep Energy Retrofit program. The objective of this program is to establish publicly accessible educational resources, supportive training initiatives, and research products that increase momentum for ambitious, widespread, and equitable retrofits, and quickly equip Canadian communities with the tools and capacity required to accelerate change. Today, we are thrilled to be releasing our 2025 National Progress Report on Retrofitting Canada's Homes. We're thrilled to be joined by some special guests. I'd like to introduce them now. So we're joined by Sharon Coward, the Executive Director of EnviroCentre. EnviroCentre is a nonprofit climate action organization that scopes, designs, delivers, and scales practical solutions to dramatically reduce climate emissions in our communities. We're also joined by Brendan Haley, who helped launch Efficiency Canada, where he now guides research and policy advocacy efforts. Brendan has a PhD in public policy from Carleton University. We're joined by Ralph Torrie, the Director of Research for Corporate Knights, a research and publishing organization that produces ranking and financial product ratings based on corporate sustainability performance. And finally, we're joined by GCC's own Jared Kolb, who is here with us today, subbing in for Kai Millyard. Jared acted as GCC's Interim Executive Director last year, and today is our Managing Director and co-author of the National Progress Report number 2. Before I pass it to Jared to delve into the report, I want to recognize some of our partners that are here today and all of those who contributed in significant ways to the work that we're sharing. A special thanks to the Peter Gilligan Foundation, the McConnell Family Foundation, the Trottier Family Foundation for your generous support of GCC's Deep Energy Retrofit program. And now I will pass things off to Jared to get us started with a presentation about the report.
Thanks so much, Brianna. There we go. Okay, thanks everybody. My name's Jared Kolb, and I play the role of Managing Director at Green Communities Canada. And I was pleased to be able to participate in the development of our progress report number 2, Retrofitting Canada's Homes. And I want to just take a moment to just look at the task first at hand. And as of course many will be familiar with, we have ambitious climate targets, and as we uh, move towards 2050, where we've got really ambitious targets of becoming ultimately net zero. Um, we want to set out our understanding, of the problem before us, especially from the perspective of Canada's housing stock. And there's roughly, as many may know, we've got roughly 12 million houses, and low-rise houses across the country. And nearly all of those must be retrofitted to some degree. We've got 25 years left, as we before 2050, and in order to make meaningful progress on that, we need to be retrofitting just shy of about 500,000 houses per year. It's also really important to remember that in terms of residential energy use, almost 2/3 of energy use is dedicated towards space heating in particular, which is important because that sets up how we like to think about the order of operations and priority in terms of retrofitting houses. And it really starts with the building shell, efficiency first. It's a critical first component. The more efficient that is, the less energy we need downstream, which, again, that means smaller, lower cost, and more efficient mechanicals. And that's what we can do second. And then third, if there's any, in terms of the energy that's required from there, the renewables, solar, etc., from there. We analyzed the retrofits available as a part of in the NRCan database, and what's just amazing is that of course we're looking at over 600,000 retrofits since 2020. Most of those are part of the Greener Homes grant program, but not all. You'll see in that graph there, the orange represents non-Greener Homes funded retrofits in the greener homes. We start there in terms of our analysis in the 2020 pre-grant program year. And we then look forward, to 2024. The program was highly successful in stimulating more retrofits. And one of the things that we certainly noticed is that just as the program was abruptly canceled in early 2024, we saw the beginning of the drop off of retrofit activity of greener homes. It's that 2020 number is important, that around that 50,000. That is how we look at the base rate, and which is really important. About 5% of the low-rise stock, was retrofitted over those 5 years. And we assume that this may drop back. The overall retrofit rate may drop back to 50,000 per year, when, of course, what we need is 480,000 per year to tackle the scale of the problem. One of the lessons learned from the report, we've got to go faster. And that, progress in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions is both about the pace as well as the depth of the savings, which we'll talk more about. In analyzing the 600,000 retrofits across the country over the last 5 years, an important note is that, in terms of average energy and greenhouse gas emission savings, this was truly, we saw meaningful achievements in terms of energy savings of around 20% and greenhouse gas emission savings of around 30%. However, we've got to go deeper to be able to get to that net zero goal. Um, in terms of something that's really kind of interesting after reviewing the data is that whereas people were investing in energy savings from building shell upgrades, you remember we talked about starting with that first. We saw that declining as the program progressed. Which is really interesting, especially because in contrast to that, heat pumps were, of course, a really successful part of the implementation of the program. We saw that the fraction of retrofits installing a heat pump just exploded. We see 60% in 2023. We also saw that renewables were growing too, and that the fraction of retrofits, installing solar, were increasing as the program progressed. We'd like to think about though is like what's possible from here, and we'd like to think about that from the perspective of deep energy retrofits, which is a retrofit that produces 50% energy savings or greater. About 5% of the 600,000 retrofits were deep energy retrofits. And these represented, in terms of energy savings, over 60% energy savings in those deep retrofits. Still some fossil fuel in use, but well on the way. We also saw, in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions as well, significant increases in the deeper retrofits. There were also a number of other benefits and a lot of good news here. In terms of affordability, over the 5-year period, an estimate that, homeowners were saving about $356 or $386 per year on average, which if you take the totality of the 600,000 retrofits, if we multiply that out over 20 years, that's 4.7 billion, in bill savings. And that's especially important considering that the cost for Canadians of this program, as funded by the federal government, was 2.6 billion. We also looked at the amount that homeowners were spending on the overall retrofit package to which the Greener Homes Grant Program provided an offset to. But we estimate that thanks to the total package of spending, that's 11 billion. For businesses. This is, in domestic, local, economic spend, which, created and supported 75,000 jobs, which is only a partial estimate of jobs so far. In terms of what's next, of course, the news last year broke. The Greener Homes program was so successful that it had exhausted its budget and was canceled prematurely. And there was a commitment issued at that time for new programming. And so Greener Homes 2 was born, and that was born, in mid-year. And, according to that program, it's a low to mid-income focused targeted program. We estimated, maybe 43,000 houses over the next 5 years will be retrofit thanks to Greener Homes 2. The new CMHC loan fund, which is not yet approved, is about 3,000 homes per year, and non-federal programs across the country of about 50,000 per year. I think that graph is crucial, right? We talked about 480,000 homes that we need to retrofit per year to reach, the goals that we spoke about. That's that big, thick green caterpillar bar of where we need to go. And then in terms of our commitments as it stands right now, are quite low and not at the scale required in terms of where we need to get to. And so our recommendations, put these before you today. One is to implement the promised affordability program, of course, but to ramp it up and expand it to 40,000 per year. So instead of 10,000 per year, we're recommending a 4-fold increase to 40,000 per year. Number 2, to launch a new grant program to emphasize building envelope savings using the EnerGuide system. Higher incentives are a must to support all upgrades needed. We saw before that, when a $5,000 grant program, was offered to Canadians, that by and large, many were using that to offset the mechanical switching from, a gas or an oil furnace to a heat pump, leaving the building shell behind. We need a greater focus here on and an emphasis on the building envelope to be able to reduce the amount of energy required in the house. Number two on that part of that is around performance incentives. And so, the deeper you go, the more money that you get back. That's an important part. Number three, professional help for homeowners. As we know, this is there's a ton of hassle involved in a home retrofit, and we know there are a number of programs that are out there that are experimenting with new approaches to assisting homeowners with this, but professional help has got to be part of this program as well. Creating a rebate program is another piece for a heat pump only installation. This wouldn't require an enter guide, but it would require sizing and properly sizing of the heat pump program. And then finally, as a part of this recommendation, managed growth over time until we're on pace to reach the target. What we saw with greener homes, one was a dramatic increase and a serious boom bust cycle. Within 2 to 3 years, it was gone after scaling up. And so, from our perspective, is a managed growth program over time. Then our final recommendation is to expand the CMHC loan program as a supplement to the grant program, offering larger zero interest loans to motivate deeper retrofits. On behalf of my co-author, Kai Millyard, who wasn't able to be here today, I want to thank everybody for joining us. That's the report. That being said, we're moving over to some responses from our esteemed panelists, and back to you, Brianna, for to move it over to our first panelist.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jared. I really appreciate your work on this report. It's phenomenal, and also the presentation that you've given to set the stage for today's speakers. So our second speaker, first panelist, is Brendan Helly, the Senior Director of Policy Strategy at Efficiency Canada. I'll pass it off to you.
Thanks, Brianna. So hey, everyone. So I work for a research and an advocacy organization. And so the role I try to play is thinking about wider policy systems that influence why a program like Greener Homes is funded and how it's implemented. So I'm going to stay at that kind of level of policy systems and talk about how different frameworks for policy, can impact the success of home retrofits. So we just discussed really the results of a program. And one thing I think I'd like to say first is that program was never really attached to a very clear goal or purpose. The funding for the Greener Homes grant was largely, I would think, a reaction and justified in terms of post-COVID economic recovery, which is, similar to like over a decade ago, the funding that was provided for the Eco Energy program. So when you've got a home retrofit program that is really a reaction to kind of boom bust economic cycles, it's perhaps not surprising that we see boom bust program budgets. So why we're trying to do this in the first place, I think really matters. And we need to move from seeing it as a short-term reaction to really thinking about programs like this as like a basic service that we need in a low carbon economy. So that access to professional help, to improve energy performance, it really should be part of almost a new social contract with people where everyone can reduce their bill. Everyone can improve their living conditions in a way that also reduces emissions in a way that makes sense for them when they need that support. So if we look at other places in the world, there's a much clearer frameworks or goals that support programs like this more long-term and get away from that boom bust. So one example is in Europe, they have something called the Buildings Performance Directive that has a goal to improve the energy performance for residential buildings. It has more concrete actions associated with it, like countries create building renovation plans, policies like renovation passports, one-stop shops for customers. We can also look at the EU and we can look at other nations. They've got goals to eliminate energy poverty, right, which frames long-term support for more low-income targeted programs. So in the United Kingdom right now, they are aiming to bring up low-income housing at least up to the median level of performance of the general building stock, right? By targeting the lowest income households and the least efficient homes. So one reason to not just have programs, but to have policy goals is also that those goals provide the stability within which you can more flexibly adapt those program strategies. And on the residential side, I think we need to start trying different things, right? If we're ever going to reach the scale that Jared talked about. And, if we just look at the Greener Home Loan Program, it's an important program. It needs to continue. It needs to not be disrupted in the way the grant was, but there's also lots of other areas for improvement or things we could do there, right? I mean, that still requires homeowners to actually put a lot of money up front, and you don't kind of get the money from the loan until you've already, handed out the cash to do the upgrades largely. And so it's not really a loan typically that is meant to reduce those upfront costs or eliminate them. It's almost like an incentive you pay back. And there's a whole bunch of other financing options models out there. There's heat as a service, there's energy as a service, there's options for people to completely remove upfront costs, to have the people doing the work have some responsibility for the energy savings. That's just one example, I think, about how financing options can be powerfully connected to larger business models or different approaches we're doing retrofits, giving customers more choices, promoting experimentation with different types of business models. I think the more we have that, the better. And really, the ability of our governments to provide that long-term, patient, low-cost capital should be encouraging a larger diversity of financing options and encouraging different types of business models of how to approach customers doing retrofits. So the other policy system element I wanted to talk about is the ability of that federal program here to spur perhaps even more investments from those provincial and utility programs, what the report, they called them these piggyback programs, right? And in the report, the numbers are really striking of what happened when the grant went away, because the retrofits just dropped, right? And so that's a good reason to see other grant and incentive programs run by utilities to also be encouraged and to be locked in. If you look at some of the performance of the maritime provinces in the report, it really shows, I think, the benefit of this. Those are provinces that have had quite, fairly robust utility provincial government energy efficiency incentives for well over a decade, also using the EnerGuide system. So thinking about, coupling is important. And there's one story out of Ontario that is interesting to me because it spurred some policy reform in utilities. And so that story is that when the natural gas demand side management program in Ontario arranged co-delivery with the federal grant program, the regulator, the Ontario Energy Board, made a decision that required natural gas incentive dollars to support people getting totally off of gas if they wanted to, but also, partial electrification of heating, which is a pretty provocative thing for the regulator to propose. Unfortunately, the grant program was sort of canceled very quickly after that decision was made. So I don't know if we ever really saw the full impact of those combined federal and natural gas program incentives. But to me, it shows that you can use these federal dollars to kind of strategically spur changes in other policy systems. And the more the federal government can think about that, not just run a program, but really strategically try to crowd in other types of money and policy changes, the more transformative we can be. So just want to conclude by thanking the authors of this report. I think there's lots more we can do, right? We can replace boom-bust program budgets with a more consistent goal. We can support experimentation, innovation within that consistent goal, and we can strategically use a federal program like this to spur complementary changes in, say, provinces, utilities, and municipalities. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you so much, Brendan. Really appreciate you being here with us today and sharing your insights and for all the work that you do at Efficiency Canada. I would like to pass it on to our next panelist, Ralph Torrie. Ralph is the Director of Research at Corporate Knights.
So I'm just going to, well, first of all, put up this title slide. I'm going to talk about retrofits with my 7 minutes from a 50,000 meter vantage point. I was going to say feet, but I'm trying to be modern man here. And we have been at Corporate Knights conducting a comprehensive scenario analysis of what a carbon-free Canada could look like in the year 2050 that is centered around efficiency, electrification, and the development of a renewables emission-free electricity grid. And we've been doing this necessarily province by province because of the differences in the electricity grids more than the differences in the housing stock. And this is on the verge of being published. We've started to put some of it out in bits and pieces to get feedback, but the report itself will be coming out in stages over the next 6 weeks or so, starting in a week. And in terms of retrofits, and some of you who know me know that I've been an advocate, a strong advocate of building retrofits over the years, and efficiency in general, still am. Worked with Brendan Haley a few years ago on a report that looked at tackling the retrofitting of Canada's housing stock, building stock, from a mission-oriented perspective, recognizing that we are not likely to get the efficiency gains in the building stock that we would like to see from a social point of view if it's left up to what the individual homeowners and building owners are likely to be willing to invest given their cost of capital and their outlook, that the value of the retrofit to society in bringing down greenhouse gas emissions is not necessarily going to get captured if this is left to individual market, individual decisions by the building owners and the homeowners. And this is an insight which is behind some of the comments that Brendan was making about the need for innovative and creative financing and policy approaches to tapping this resource. But let me just briefly show you the way retrofits look with this bird's eye view that I was speaking of earlier. In our scenario, and this is for all of Canada, we've done this for every province, but for all of Canada, what you're looking at here in the upper left is a scenario for the future of electricity consumption in Canada year by year out to the year 2050, broken down by various end uses, including heavy industry, lighting. The oil and gas industry is the one sliver that gets smaller, obviously, in such a future. General manufacturing, agriculture. The blue piece is the commercial building sector. The dark green are the trucks, which all are electrified in this scenario. The lighter green are the personal vehicles, which are all electrified in this scenario. And then of greatest interest to the top of relevance to the topic today is this red bar on the top. This is the space heating for residential and commercial buildings. And it includes both the solid red portion and this patterned red portion that sits on top. Let me explain the difference between those two. The amount of electricity that will be required to power all of the heat pumps in all of the buildings in Canada, because this scenario involves 100% electrification of buildings and 100% electrification of vehicles as well, by the way. But the amount of electricity that will be needed to power all of those heat pumps is the combination of the solid red and the pattern red layers that you see in this graph. If we don't do any retrofits, if we only converted the buildings to emission-free status by the application of heat pump technology, then we would only we would have to produce this entire amount. The solid red represents the amount of electricity that would be needed if we do the retrofits. And the retrofit assumptions in our report varied by building type and vintage and so on, but they're fairly deep. And I'd like to define a deep retrofit in physical terms, not in percentage reductions. And the residential buildings in this scenario, for example, achieve a thermal output for the building energy nerds in the crowd in the range of 55 to 65 or 70 kilowatt hours per square meter. We try to get the building stock down to that level, whether it's a single family detached or a multifamily or an apartment building will determine to a certain extent where in that range a dwelling unit resides, but pretty deep retrofits. So for some buildings, particularly for some of the older buildings. One thing that I would point out about this future is that the greatest first of all, the growth, you may have noticed there's not a lot of growth in the overall use of space heat at the national level if you do the retrofits, even though we have population growth in here of 0.9% per year out to 2050 with a corresponding growth in the housing stock. And the reason that the growth in electricity use in total is so modest at the national level is that there are a number of provinces in Canada that have so much electric resistant space heating now in their starting year situation that when they convert that to heat pumps, it actually frees up electricity supply and it moderates the total growth that otherwise would occur in electricity consumption needed for space heat in this future. It's a very important point. Most of the largest contribution to the growth of electricity in the carbon-free future comes from the vehicles in energy terms. But then look over here on the right-hand side, and you'll see why it is actually space heat which has the most disruptive impact on the grid. These two pictures, the top one is for now, for 2025, and the bottom one is for 2050. And they go from January to December, and there's a data point for each week representing the electricity consumption by week for Canada as a whole. And it's, again, layered by end uses, with the red representing space heat. And of course, in the year 2050, we have not only the solid red, but the additional electricity that we would have to come up with if we don't retrofit. So this really represents the contribution to the peak from retrofits, or what we can save on the peak from retrofits. And it's worth tens of billions of dollars, perhaps as much as $100 billion in terms of the overall cost of this transition that we would have to go through if we really want to be serious about getting to zero emissions in this country. So the retrofits are critically important for this transition. Getting to zero emissions, it's the heat pumps that do that. No amount of efficiency improvements will get a building to zero if it's burning fossil fuels, obviously. But the combination of the heat pump conversion and the thermal efficiency upgrade makes a huge difference to just how much peak capacity will have to be built that's going to have to be supplied with solar and wind and storage. And this is so important because the frame that we bring to evaluating the cost effectiveness, if you like, of retrofits hinges on how much it's going to cost us to supply the electricity if we don't retrofit. And that's a moving target. And I won't elaborate on that now. I think I've used my time up, but suffice it to say, the relative advantage that deeper retrofits have gets smaller. And this is a challenge to those of us who are pushing for a stronger retrofit component in our climate change response. It's happening against a backdrop of falling price outlooks for what it's going to cost to provide the peak capacity that the retrofit would otherwise avoid. And this is going to remain a central pivot point in our conversations about the viability of ground source heat pumps, which are on the bubble, and about the viability of deeper retrofits going forward, as opposed to building up the winter supply capacity that would be necessary to supply those houses if they were not retrofit to such a deep level. I'll leave it at that because I think I've used my time up and then some. But stay tuned. This is a very small glimpse into a very large study that will be coming out over the next month. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ralph. We really appreciate your presentation, and I really look forward to reading the study once it's out. The next presenter that we have, our last presenter before we get into our Q&A, is Sharon Coward, the Executive Director at EnviroCentre. Sharon, thanks for being here with us today.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Oops. All right, I'm just going to get my slides up as well. Right. So can folks see my slides? Seeing a nod, that's excellent. So thank you so much, everyone. It is great to be here today with all of these great experts on the topic. I'm Sharon Coward. I'm the Executive Director at EnviroCentre. EnviroCentre is a not-for-profit climate action organization that's based in Ottawa, and our work focuses on designing and delivering practical projects that result in measurable emissions reductions. So that means that we primarily focus on making things happen on the ground, and in this case, that means bringing deep energy retrofits to life. So I'm not going to delve too much into policy here, but instead I'm going to speak from our knowledge base and then tie it back into the overall theme. I'm going to talk a little bit about a project we are doing at EnviroCentre to try to move forward the retrofit market in Canada. I'll give you an overview of what we're trying to do and why, and then talk about how our work points at present to the same findings as the GCC report on the state of the sector overall. So, our project. EnviroCentre is running a retrofit accelerator that supports deep retrofits in small residential social housing across Eastern Ontario. This is a market development initiative that is taking one angle to wrestle with the enormous task of deep retrofitting Canada's 12 million small residential homes. GCC's report highlights that this is equivalent to doing 500,000 deep retrofits per year, or they actually said 450,000, so close enough, for the foreseeable future. And it looks like the evidence shows that the Greener Homes Grant Program incentivized around this number over 5 years for context, and the vast majority of those were not deep retrofits. So this is a really big job that requires on the ground a little bit of a smaller scale to get a handle on it. EnviroCentre has specialized over the years in affordable housing retrofits in Eastern Ontario. So we set our sights on this section of the market and asked the question, how can deep retrofits be completed across all small residential social housing units in Eastern Ontario by 2040? And we don't mean that in a theoretical sense. We mean that literally on the ground. What will it take to plan, finance, and complete these retrofits? What if we were doing it ourselves as an organization? What needs to be in place? In context, this is around 26,000 small residential units. Actually, the data on this building stock in our region is fairly terrible, and we're working on that, but this is a ballpark estimate for our conversation today. So, great. In the context of the retrofit market across Canada, why start here to look at the problem? Well, I'm glad you asked. There are two sets of reasons to focus in on social housing when trying to look at how to accelerate the deep retrofit economy. First, there is what this work can achieve mission-wise. So by focusing on social housing units and mass retrofits, we're able to learn about the mechanics and the economic realities of mass retrofits on the ground. And we're going to need that skill to scale the pace of retrofits to the pace required to meet our targets. Second, social housing deep retrofits improve the conditions, homes, health, and the bottom line for some of our most vulnerable residents. So the social impact case is good. And third, by focusing on this segment of the population, we ensure that some of our most vulnerable residents are positively impacted by the energy transition first. And so these are all good things. But there are also practical reasons why starting with this type of housing makes sense as a starting point for market acceleration. Social housing providers are one owner for multiple units, and this makes the mass retrofit approach exponentially easier. Today, there are financing, grant, and incentive programs available for social housing more than there are for many other home types. And lastly, cost reductions are easier in this market. There are the cost benefits of the mass retrofit approach, which is essentially economies of scale, but also businesses will throw in a good deal for a social housing project. Basically, everybody agrees that work in this area is valuable, so that is definitely a step up. And there's a reason for that. Deep retrofits in social housing have good results for the residents, for the owners, for the grid, and for our society overall. So we developed a project that would make it as easy as possible for a housing provider to plan, finance, and complete mass deep retrofit projects smoothly and cost effectively. You can see in this slide an outline of the services we provide to support this work. And in 2 years of delivering, I can confidently tell you that there is no better way to get a sense of the state of the retrofit market and the economy than by planning, stacking financial resources for, and delivering a social housing deep retrofit. If you're looking to get some perspective on the scale of the task of deep retrofitting Canada's small residential building stock, you should set up a chat with some members of our team and they can give you an earful. 2 years in, we have one master retrofit in motion with 63 units to be completed this spring. We have 6 other providers engaged in the planning stages and about 670 units in process. We're also doing a whole range of other things to engage in the development of this market and ultimately in addressing the big problem of how to complete mass retrofits over the coming years. I'm not going to talk about these because there isn't time here, but this is a view of a few of them. But for right now, let's go back to the really big picture, the state of the residential retrofit market in Canada, and how does the work that we're doing in this on-the-ground project connect into this GCC report? I pulled out a few key points that are true in our work and are also teased out in the report, and I think they're good thinking points for all of us as a group. So, number one, none of this work is possible without incentives, grants, and zero interest loans, at least not today. Number two, incentives are a huge motivator to get housing providers interested in even thinking about this work. So even if there's actually a really good cost case for the work and other reasons to complete it, the conversation is incredibly hard to start without incentives on the table. And third, the ROI on most of these projects without incentives is still actually not enough, and it won't move building owners into action. And this will get worse with the removal of the consumer carbon tax. So at the end of the day, our team is going to get better at this work and other teams across the country through practice and experience. Costs will go down, the process will get simpler, the case will be better presented to housing providers, but nevertheless, the fact remains that the bottom could fall out of this work unless at the end of the day, the ROI provides a clear case for deep retrofits on its own, or funding supports remain in place and increase. I want to leave you this afternoon with a set of questions that are top of mind for us as we look down the road on this project and on the future of deep retrofits in small residential housing across Canada. So number one, how do you support a team like ours over the long term? We know that people need this type of support to make these projects happen, but they are not willing in our experience to pay out of pocket for it. Number two, will the market ever support paying for GHG reductions that do not result in clear, immediate cost reductions to the spender? Number three, how do we make the case for the value of GHG reductions irrefutable to everyone who's a stakeholder? Number four, how do we create an irrefutable cost case on the savings alone? So if I had to answer these questions today, I would probably give these answers. How do you support a team like ours over the long term? The cost of our team and others across the country like ours have to be included in the total retrofit costs and still be able to make a strong case for an ROI. Number two, will the market ever support paying for GHG reductions that do not result in clear immediate cost reductions to the spender? It doesn't look that way today. We'll see. Number three, how do we make the case for the value of GHG reductions irrefutable? Well, as many folks in this room know, that is a long game, and it's very hard if the audience is the average person or business, and folks have been working on this for 30 years plus. So number four, how do we create an irrefutable cost case based on the savings alone, given the factors mentioned above? And one of the answers to that is incentives, grants, zero interest financing, energy as a service, and other creative models that are probably yet to emerge. But the ones that we have, these incentives and that we've been talking about across this meeting, are really an essential piece of solving the retrofit market puzzle that we are trying to solve for our net zero future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I really appreciate your presentation, and I really appreciate all the work that you guys do at EnviroCentre. It's really inspiring for the rest of the country. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Jared, who is going to lead us in a Q&A for the 13 minutes we have remaining. Jared, thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Brianna. And thanks, Sharon. Thanks, Ralph, and thanks, Brendan, for compelling presentations, and to everyone who have fed some really interesting questions into the Q&A function here on Zoom, as well as registrants who proposed questions ahead of time. I think first, I just want to pick up perhaps where Sharon left off in part, and we had a question from a registrant right out of the gates, which has to do with ensuring that the cost of retrofits aren't passed on to tenants, and what sorts of either policy interventions or other tools needed to make sure agreements that are made transparent to tenants so they know what's happening in their home, especially if landlords are getting grants or incentives from the government to retrofit. And happy to put this one right back to you, Sharon, with curiosity, but also very interested in perspectives here from Brendan or from Ralph.
I'd really love to punt that to the policy people for their first perspective, and I see Brendan waving in the air, so go right ahead.
Yeah, well, if you go to the Efficiency Canada website, we have a big report on just about this. It's called Energy Efficiency in Rental Housing, and we also have some policy briefs on it. And yeah, we really wanted to dig into this tension of, if you retrofit a home, you could have problems like rent increases and rent evictions. And that's not a problem with energy efficiency per se. It's a problem with not having the right policy mix to also protect tenants. So what we proposed was really like a tenant bill of rights for an energy efficiency program. And that includes things like understanding what the retrofit work is, understanding the energy performance of the building after the retrofit work, so you understand what opportunities and savings are shared between you and the landlord. And then what the US does, some places in Canada, they have these things called affordability covenants, which is a formal agreement between tenant, landlord, and the program administrator that commits to maintaining affordable rents, heads up if a rent increase is going to happen, protection against eviction, even things like access to legal resources. So if you do need legal advice, that should perhaps be part of that agreement. And if the landlord doesn't abide by that agreement, and one thing the program can immediately do is they can take away that incentive and ask for it to be paid back with interest. And then, municipal governments, provincial governments can actually back that up with further penalties. So there's lots of things we can do. Check out those reports. There's a bunch of ideas in there.
Excellent. That's great. Thanks so much, Brendan. Ralph, Sharon, any ways in which you want to intersect or respond on that?
Just to say that the focus of our work, especially this piece that I'm talking about, is on social housing. And so we're often dealing directly with landlords who are fully committed to maintaining their affordable rents. And in that instance, the issue that we're more frequently dealing with is the savings from the retrofit actually going to the tenants rather than to the landlord who's paying for the work. And so there's some thinking around that needs to happen. But certainly providing free of charge energy efficiency measures to these housing providers is incredibly helpful for that. So that, and in that case, you're not needing to sign on to an agreement as you would in the private markets, because these providers are locked in, and it really helps make the cost case for doing those types of retrofits.
That's great. Thanks, Sharon. And appreciate it if you can check in the chat for one of the reports that Brendan was just referring to. Ralph, any comments before we move to the next
one?
I
mean, I would defer people to the work that energy efficiency does on this. I would just say that nobody should have to be uncomfortably cold or uncomfortably hot in their home.
That's great. Yeah, really appreciate that, Ralph. I'm going to go to some questions that came in from the chat. There's a couple of them that sort of intersect and overlap a little bit. So I'm trying to summarize some of these here. So first of all, I guess, and this one is a kind of an open one to all panelists, but some of the regional considerations and whether heat pumps are a consideration, in terms of from province to province. Are they viable, in every province and in every climate across Canada? Are they just a good idea in general? But yeah, really trying to dig in on some of the regional complexities of from the heat pump adoption at scale.
Well, I could take a little bit of just having been through simulating this province by province. There are big differences. If I could categorize provincial types, you have some very cold provinces which have traditionally not used electricity much for heating. That would include Alberta and Saskatchewan, where you have the added problem that the air source heat pump's efficiency declines with colder temperatures. In our scenario, we've been using ground source heat pumps in the prairie provinces to a much greater extent than we do in the more moderate climates, and it makes a big difference in the. I think the ground source makes a lot of sense in the colder parts of the country, in spite of the extra cost. In the provinces that are hydro rich, it's interesting. The move to heat pumps is still a good idea in Quebec and Manitoba and Newfoundland, and we still build it into our simulation, even though these are provinces which could probably go a long way to having emission-free grids without a massive transition of their stock. You can't get to zero emissions, though, without electrifying the buildings. This is the thing about heat pumps is, unlike retrofits, they get the building off fossil fuel, which is what we have to do if we're going to get to zero emissions. And the other thing is that's come up here today is that the cost of the retrofit versus the cost of the heat pump, there's a big difference. This is why the report that we're discussing today has found that people are leaning into heat pumps much more than they are into efficiency. That's one of the reasons anyway. And you see this at the big picture as well. So, but yeah, big differences from province to province. But everywhere, the heat pump is one of the workhorses, along with the electric vehicle, of getting the transition to zero emissions to actually happen. I mean, there are some things that can contribute. Biomass can contribute in some circumstances with some argument over its sustainability. But there's a strong consensus now that it will require electrification of building heat to get to zero emissions, and the heat pump is the way to do that, whether it's air source or ground source. Does vary from circumstance to circumstance, but yeah, heat pumps will be the norm in the future if the future is going to be a sustainable future.
Thanks so much, Ralph. That's great. Sharon, Brendan, go ahead.
If I'm reading the question right, it was about kind of the greenhouse gas impacts, and I guess the thing that I'm seeing and following, different demand side management plans and provincial policies is, so Quebec has the cleanest electricity grid, and Quebec is really emphasizing right now that they need to like double or triple their amount of electricity savings. Right? I mean, in New Brunswick has the highest rate of heat pump deployment. And people are really getting shocked on their electricity bills right now. And they've got major issues with electricity bill affordability. And the utility at least is, I think, signaling some issues with like that system running into some constraints. So, even in a clean energy system, it can make sense to save electricity, right? Because that electricity can be used for better purposes. It can help you manage those peak demands. It can help you manage those affordability issues. And that's what I'm seeing in real life right now. And that doesn't necessarily mean the retrofits of the home that gets the heat pump, right? It could mean electricity savings in the entire system, right? To make some room for some buildings to get some heat pumps, you might go for your electricity savings in, like, say, industrial operations, right? But yeah, I'm just saying that even with clean electricity, there's a role for better management of energy demand.
That's great. Sharon?
Just really briefly to speak to the affordability side and specifically to the piece of work that we do, that one of the challenges is that many homes across the country are heated by fossil fuels, and in many parts of the country, electricity is more expensive. And in the social housing context, when we're putting together retrofits to fuel switch, it's actually still proving very challenging to make a cost case that means that the tenant, who is low income, is not paying more in their utilities. And so that's one of the things that we're looking at. Much simpler, obviously, if you're electrifying in an area that has a lot of electrically heated homes where the cost is going to go down. And so that's not a question of whether heat pumps will work across the country. The answer to that is, for the most part, yes, they will. But will they work affordably in some of these contexts? I think we have to really be considering that, and especially when you're looking at lower income residents and tenants.
That's great. Thanks so much, Sharon. We've had a tremendous number of questions in the chat, and really appreciate that. We'll try to target some of these in our 2 minutes remaining. And I'm curious about perhaps this question, which is considering everything that's going on right now, in the wider economy, pressures from our American allies or former allies, with everything going on, right now, do you think anybody really is that interested in this right now? And what's the role, for this type of approach, and it's especially with added incentives? Does this matter right now?
Oh, it matters more than it ever has. What we're seeing here in Canada, and it's been so refreshing over the last few weeks, is a realization of the possibilities for a more economically independent Canada, for a reinforcement of traditional Canadian values, which have always set us aside from the Americans, which include, for example, the priority to some of the issues we've been discussing with regard to making sure that we don't fall into energy poverty and all of that. The things that we need to do in order to build an emission-free economy in this country are the things that will strengthen the Canadian economy and strengthen the Canadian Federation. The cross-Canada transmission line is a good example of that. It will bring tremendous benefits across the country, and it's absolutely essential to achieving a zero-emission future that we are able to move electricity across the country easily. The retrofit, to come back to today's topic, the retrofit of homes is something that brings the response to climate change into every community in a way that none of the other options do. The employment it generates is spread out everywhere where there are buildings. The economic benefits are spread out everywhere where there are buildings. In other words, it is the perfect example of a measure which addresses climate change while at the same time helping to build that community-based economic strength, which is going to be one of the foundations of the new Canadian economy, which is going to emerge from this new international order, which was basically kicked off today with the tariffs and the changing, as our Prime Minister said. This is a fundamental change to the international order. And climate change and the type of economy we need are going to be very synergistic as we move forward into this future. So I think in general, we should be quite optimistic that what we need to do to strengthen our economy is also what we need to do to get to a zero emission future.
Amazing. Thank you, Ralph. I think that's the right message to end on. And I appreciate the hope and optimism. I think that's embedded in the report, and that's embedded in the comments from all panelists today. Thanks everybody for joining, and especially for our esteemed presenters. Thank you so much for your contributions and the generous presence today. Want to remind everybody to look for the follow-up survey, an email with resources, and watch for details soon for our next Voices for Action webinar, which will be coming later this spring. Thanks, Ralph. Thanks, Sharon. Thanks, Brendan.